Why would a dying dog spend his last strength watching the trees? The rain had been falling since noon, a cold November rain that turned the old logging road into a ribbon of mud beneath the dark pines of western Washington. Cole Bennett almost missed the cage. He was driving slowly toward the cabin his father had left behind, windshield wipers beating a tired rhythm across the glass, when something pale flashed between the trees. Not movement. Metal. Cole drove another 50 feet before his hands tightened around the wheel. For several seconds, he stared through the rearview mirror at nothing but rain and gray timber. Then he stopped. The engine idled beneath him. Somewhere beyond the road, water whispered through cedar branches, and beneath that sound came something smaller. A faint scrape. Cole backed up, pulled onto the shoulder, and stepped into the rain. At 37, the former Navy SEAL still moved with the quiet caution years of training had carved into him. But there was no mission here, no team waiting for his signal. Only wet earth, pine, and a forest disappearing into mist. The cage sat 20 yards from the road beneath a leaning fir, half hidden by ferns. Rust stained its corners. Mud had gathered beneath it. Inside lay a German shepherd. Cole stopped. The dog was an adult male, black and tan beneath the rain-darkened coat, thin enough that his frame showed beneath the fur. His amber eyes were open. That alone felt like a small act of defiance. "Hey, buddy," Cole said softly. The shepherd did not look at him. Cole crouched several feet away and set his hands where the dog could see them. No sudden movement. No demand for trust. Rain slipped from Cole's hair and traced the collar of his jacket. "I'm not going to bother you." "Nothing." Cole returned to his truck, brought back a bottle of water, and poured some into the shallow plastic lid of an old food container. He slid it carefully through the bars. The shepherd's nose moved. Once, but he still did not drink. His gaze remained fixed beyond Cole, through the dripping ferns, toward the deeper forest. Cole followed it. Nothing stood there. No house. No person. Only trunks fading into gray. Then the dog made a sound. Not a bark. Not quite a growl. A low warning carried on one exhausted breath. Cole looked back at him. "What do you hear?" The shepherd's ears shifted forward. For the first time, something stronger than exhaustion entered those amber eyes. Urgency. Cole rose slowly and examined the cage. The latch was intact. So was the door. A small weathered padlock hung from the outside. His expression changed. This dog had not wandered in here. Someone had closed the door and walked away. Cole looked toward the forest again. The shepherd gathered what little strength remained, lifted his head, and stared into the trees as though whatever had happened to him mattered less than what was still waiting out there. Cole stayed beside the cage for another moment, listening to the rain settle over the forest, but the German shepherd never turned his eyes away from the trees. Whatever held the dog's attention could wait. Keeping him alive could not. Cole returned to the truck and came back with a pair of bolt cutters from the emergency kit behind the seat. The padlock resisted once before giving way with a dull metallic snap. He lowered the cage door carefully. "You decide when you come out," he murmured. The shepherd tried. One front paw reached into the mud, followed by the other, but his strength disappeared almost immediately. Cole caught him before he fell, surprised by how little weight there was beneath the wet coat. "All right, I have you." The words came naturally, and for reasons Cole did not understand, they hurt. He wrapped the dog in an old wool blanket and carried him toward the truck. The shepherd remained quiet against his chest, yet his head turned toward the forest until the cage vanished behind the rain. Cole understood that kind of looking back. For nearly 2 years, he had been doing the same thing. At 37, Cole Bennett had spent most of his adult life knowing exactly where he belonged. The United States Navy had given his days structure, and the SEAL teams had given them purpose. There had always been another morning, another responsibility, another person counting on him to show up. Civilian life had arrived without any of those things. People called it coming home. Cole had never found the phrase accurate. Home was supposed to feel like arrival. Instead, he had spent 23 months moving through rented rooms and temporary jobs, answering old friends with polite messages and declining invitations before anyone could ask twice. Then his father died quietly the previous spring and left him a small cabin outside a mountain town in Washington. Cole came north telling everyone he needed time to repair the place. The truth was harder to name. The cabin stood 11 miles from town, surrounded by enough forest to make silence feel permanent. No neighbors close enough to notice his lights. No teammates knocking at sunrise. No one expecting him anywhere. That had been the appeal. Until today, Cole opened the passenger door and settled the shepherd across the seat, keeping the blanket loose around him. He placed the water nearby. This time, after several seconds, the dog lowered his muzzle and drank. Only a little. Cole watched without smiling, but something in his face softened. Good. The shepherd lifted his eyes toward him for the first time. Amber met gray-blue. There was no instant trust in that look, no gratitude shaped for a sentimental story. Only exhaustion and caution, and perhaps the smallest question. Cole understood that, too. He started the engine and turned the heat low. "There is a veterinary clinic in town," he said. "We will start there." As the truck rolled away, Cole glanced toward the empty road ahead. He had driven into these mountains hoping the world would stop asking anything of him. Now a half-frozen German shepherd lay beside him, breathing softly beneath his father's old blanket, and for the first time in months, Cole had somewhere he needed to be. The veterinary clinic sat near the edge of town between a hardware store and a small diner, glowing warm against the November rain. By the time Cole carried the German shepherd through the front door, evening had settled over the valley, turning the windows into dark mirrors streaked with water. The receptionist took one look at the soaked blanket and disappeared through a swinging door. Less than a minute later, Dr. Emily Warren came out, a woman in her early 40s with tired blue eyes and the calm voice of someone accustomed to frightened animals. She led Cole into an examination room that smelled of antiseptic, clean cotton, and faintly of dog food. The shepherd remained quiet while she checked him. His breathing was weak but steady. He was badly dehydrated, underweight, and exhausted from exposure, but Emily found no reason to believe recovery was impossible. "He needs warmth, fluids, food in small amounts, and time," she said. Cole looked down at the dog. "Time I can give him." Emily glanced at the faded indentation around the shepherd's neck. He wore a collar recently. Cole remembered the cage, the intact latch, the padlock hanging outside. Someone left him there. Emily stopped writing. She did not ask Cole how he knew. Something in his voice made the answer unnecessary. While she prepared fluids, Cole returned to his truck for the blanket and noticed mud clinging to the sleeve of his jacket. He brushed it away, then saw a strip of worn brown leather beneath the passenger seat. He reached down and pulled it free. A collar. It must have caught on the blanket when he lifted the dog from the cage. The leather was old but sturdy, torn near the buckle. No identification tag remained. Only a small metal emblem pressed into the leather, shaped like a pine tree inside a circle. Cole turned it beneath the parking lot light. It did not look decorative. It looked official. When he brought the collar inside, the shepherd saw it before Emily did. His head lifted from the folded towel. His ears moved forward. For the first time since Cole found him, the dog tried to stand. "Easy," Cole said, setting the collar on the counter. The shepherd stared at it, then toward the rain-darkened window. A quiet sound rose from his chest. The same warning Cole had heard beside the cage. Emily looked at Cole. "That means something to him." "Yeah." Cole picked up the collar and studied the emblem again. "I think it does." An hour later, Emily said the shepherd was stable enough to leave if Cole could keep him warm and watch him through the night. Cole agreed before she finished explaining. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. He settled the dog into the truck and placed the collar on the dashboard. The shepherd watched it for several seconds, then slowly lowered his head onto the blanket. Cole started toward the cabin, but at the first intersection, he noticed a wooden county sign beside the road. The same pine tree inside the same circle. Beneath it were 4 words, Cedar Ridge Forest District. Cole looked at the collar, then at the shepherd. Somewhere beyond the windshield, hidden behind miles of wet timber and darkness, the forest seemed to be waiting. The cabin was dark when Cole turned onto the narrow gravel drive, but the porch lights still worked, casting a pale circle across wet cedar boards and the old rocking chair his father had never thrown away. He carried the German shepherd inside and laid him on a folded blanket near the fireplace. Soon dry wood began to crackle, filling the room with the scent of pine smoke and warmth. Cole placed fresh water beside the dog and measured out the small portion of food Dr. Warren had recommended. The shepherd ate slowly, pausing between bites as though his body had forgotten what safety felt like. Cole sat several feet away and said nothing. Trust, he knew, could not be ordered into existence. Near midnight, The dog finally slept. Cole left the worn collar on the kitchen counter, the small pine emblem catching orange reflections from the fire. He should have gone to bed, but instead he sat in his father's chair with a mug of coffee growing cold between his hands. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The cabin settled around them. For a few hours, nothing asked to be understood. Then Cole opened his eyes. The fire had burned low. The shepherd was standing. Weakly, but standing. He faced the front window, ears forward, body perfectly still. Cole checked the clock above the stove. 2:17 in the morning. What is it? The dog did not turn. Beyond the glass, the forest was black except for a faint silver wash of clouded moonlight. Cole stepped beside him. Nothing moved between the trees. No headlights crossed the distant road. No animal called. After nearly a minute, the shepherd returned to his blanket. The next day passed quietly. Cole gave him water, food, and space. By afternoon, the dog crossed the room on his own. That evening, Cole found him lying near the front door, watching the narrow gap beneath it as wind carried the smell of wet earth into the cabin. On the second night, Cole woke without knowing why. 2:17. The shepherd stood at the same window. On the third night, Cole stayed awake. At 2:16, the dog was asleep beside the fireplace. 1 minute later, his eyes opened. His head lifted. His ears turned toward the north. Then he rose. Cole followed him to the window and listened. At first there was only wind moving through Douglas firs and the faint rush of a creek somewhere downhill. Then it came. Low, distant, mechanical. A steady hum lasting perhaps 10 seconds before fading into the night. Cole's expression tightened. The nearest public road in that direction was miles away, and according to the county map hanging beside his father's desk, nothing lay north of the cabin except protected forest. The shepherd gave a soft warning in his throat. Cole looked down at him. You hear that every night, do you? The dog stared into the darkness. Cole reached for the worn collar on the counter and held the pine emblem beneath the lamp. Cedar Ridge Forest District. He turned back toward the window. The shepherd was still watching the trees. This time, Cole was watching with him. Morning came without rain, leaving the forest wrapped in silver fog and the cabin roof dripping steadily into the ferns below. Cole had slept less than 2 hours. By sunrise, coffee was warming on the stove, an old county map covered the kitchen table, and the German shepherd was standing beside him as though the previous night had settled something between them. Cole traced the northern boundary of Cedar Ridge Forest District with one finger. Beyond the cabin, nearly 6 miles of protected timber stretched toward an abandoned service route marked on his father's map, but missing from the newer county map Cole had picked up in town. That bothered him. Not enough to mean anything by itself. Enough to remember. The shepherd nudged the door. You were supposed to be resting. Amber eyes met his. Cole almost smiled. That argument works better when you are not already standing. He packed water, food, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit, then opened the door. The shepherd stepped into the cold morning and immediately turned north. They moved slowly. Cole refused to let the dog set a pace his recovering body could not maintain, stopping often along the narrow trail while fog drifted between the Douglas firs. The forest smelled of cedar bark, moss, and clean earth. For the first mile, nothing seemed unusual. Then the shepherd left the trail. He slipped between sword ferns and stopped beside 2 old wooden posts nearly swallowed by blackberry vines. Cole cleared away the growth. Beneath it ran a road, or what had once been one. Twin tracks disappeared beneath moss and fallen needles, wide enough for a truck, climbing deeper into the timber. Cole checked his map. Nothing. The shepherd continued forward. Half a mile later, Cole noticed fresh impressions pressed into a patch of soft ground. Tire tracks. Recent. The dog lowered his nose and followed them until the air changed. The scent of wet pine gave way to something faintly metallic. Ahead, a narrow creek crossed beneath the forgotten road. The shepherd stopped at the bank and would not drink. Cole crouched. A thin, unnatural sheen moved across one quiet pocket of water before disappearing downstream. He filled a small empty bottle with a sample and slipped it into his pack. All right, he murmured. Now I am listening. The shepherd moved toward a stand of young firs and began nosing through the leaves. Cole followed and saw something glint beneath the brown needles. He knelt and uncovered a round metal tag attached to a short piece of torn leather. Mud covered most of its surface. Cole wiped it clean with his thumb. One side carried the same pine emblem as the collar. He turned it over. A name had been engraved there. Atlas. Beneath it was a phone number. Cole looked at the shepherd. The dog had gone perfectly still. Atlas, he said quietly. The ears lifted. Cole felt something shift inside his chest. He said it again, softer this time. Atlas. The German shepherd stepped forward and pressed his nose against the tag in Cole's palm. Then he looked past him, farther up the hidden road. Cole closed his fingers around the tag. The forest had finally given the dog back his name. But Atlas was telling him they had not yet found what he came here to find. Cole waited until they were back at the cabin before calling the number on Atlas's tag. The afternoon fog had lifted, but clouds still pressed low over the mountains, and the German shepherd lay beside the fireplace with his head raised, watching Cole hold the phone. The first call went unanswered. The second reached an automated message saying the number was no longer in service. Cole stared at the tag in his palm, then drove into town while Atlas rested at the cabin. At the Cedar Ridge Forest District office, an older clerk named Margaret Ellis recognized the pine emblem immediately. When Cole placed the tag on the counter, the color left her expression. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In the North Woods." Margaret looked at the engraved name. Atlas belonged to Walter Hayes. She explained that Walter had served as a forest ranger in Cedar Ridge for more than 20 years. He knew the streams, service roads, fire breaks, and old-growth stands better than anyone. Atlas went almost everywhere with him. Then, late the previous summer, Walter began raising concerns about unusual nighttime activity in a restricted section of the forest. Trucks where no trucks were scheduled. Equipment sounds after midnight. Changes in the water near one of the creeks. He filed reports, but before the questions went far, Walter disappeared from his normal routine. His house was emptied. His phone was disconnected. People assumed he had moved away after retiring. And Atlas? Cole asked. Margaret shook her head. Gone too. That was the strange part. Walter loved that dog. He would not leave without him. Cole felt the weight of the tag against his fingers. He did not. Margaret looked up. Cole told her about the cage, the hidden road, the tire tracks, and the creek Atlas refused to drink from. He left out assumptions. Facts were enough. By dusk, Cole was back at the cabin. Atlas stood when he entered, still weak but stronger than he had been days earlier. Cole crouched and held out the tag. Walter Hayes, he said. Atlas's ears rose at once. His tail moved once against the floor. Cole repeated the name. This time Atlas stepped closer, pressing his muzzle into Cole's hand. There it was. Not proof that could fit inside a report, but recognition too immediate to mistake. Cole attached the tag carefully to the worn collar and fastened it around Atlas's neck. For the first time since the cage, the shepherd seemed to carry something familiar again. A name, a history, someone who had once expected him home. Outside, evening settled blue between the trees. Atlas walked to the window and looked north. Cole stood beside him. Somewhere beyond those miles of timber was the reason Walter had vanished from Cedar Ridge, and perhaps the reason Atlas had been locked away. Cole had come to Washington hoping to disappear quietly. Now he understood something the dog had known from the beginning. Someone else had disappeared first, and Atlas had never stopped waiting for someone to notice. The next morning, Cole did not follow Atlas into the forest. He made 3 phone calls instead. The first went to Margaret Ellis at the Cedar Ridge Forest District office. The second went to the county environmental response line. The third went to a regional investigator whose number Margaret found in an old emergency directory. Cole gave them only what he could support: the abandoned service road, recent tire tracks, the strange nighttime machinery, the water sample, Walter Hayes, and a German shepherd who had been found locked in a cage near the same section of forest Walter had once questioned. By noon, 2 forest officers and an environmental specialist were standing at Cole's kitchen table studying his father's map. Atlas rested near the fireplace, his worn collar back around his neck, the metal tag giving a soft click whenever he shifted. Cole marked the hidden road with a pencil. The sound starts around 2:17 in the morning, he said. One officer looked at him. Every night. 3 nights in a row. Cole pointed farther north. And the creek crosses here. Nobody called it evidence of anything yet. Cole respected that. Assumptions could make people careless. Facts made them look twice. That afternoon, the group entered the forest without Atlas. Cole wanted the shepherd to rest, and for once Atlas seemed willing to let him go. The old service road looked different in daylight. Moss covered most of it, but beneath the green surface were signs of recent use. Compressed earth, fresh tire impressions, broken fern stems along the shoulder. Near the creek, the environmental specialist filled several sealed containers and photographed the faint sheen moving across the slow water. Farther uphill, they found temporary equipment tucked behind a stand of young firs, along with hoses running toward an old industrial access site that county records listed as inactive. Nothing dramatic announced what had happened there. No warning sign. No obvious catastrophe. That was what unsettled Cole most. Harm did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it moved quietly through soil and water while everyone slept. Over the next 2 days, state environmental officials joined the investigation. The northern section of Cedar Ridge was temporarily closed while samples were tested and records reviewed. Cole stayed out of their way. His part had been to notice. Their part was to determine the truth. Atlas spent those days recovering beside the cabin fire, eating more each morning and sleeping without waking at 2:17. On the third afternoon, Margaret drove up the gravel road carrying a folder against her chest. Cole met her on the porch. They confirmed contamination near the old access site, she said. They caught it before it traveled much farther downstream. Cole looked toward the trees. The creek eventually fed a larger watershed serving farms and homes throughout the valley. Margaret followed his gaze. Walter was trying to warn people months ago. Inside, Atlas heard the name and rose. Margaret stepped through the doorway and froze when she saw him. Her eyes filled, but she smiled. That is him. Atlas approached slowly. Margaret crouched and held out her hand. Hello, old friend. He sniffed her fingers, then looked toward Cole. That small glance landed harder than Cole expected. Atlas was checking where he belonged now, even while remembering where he had been. Margaret opened the folder. There is something else. She placed an old personnel record on the table. Walter Hayes had listed an emergency contact years earlier, a sister in Oregon. Margaret had called her that morning. Walter had not vanished into the wilderness. After months of stress and declining health, he had gone to stay with family near the coast. He had believed Atlas was lost before he left Cedar Ridge. He is alive? Cole asked. Margaret nodded. And when I told him we found Atlas, he could not speak for almost a minute. The shepherd stood beside Cole, listening to a name he knew and words he could not understand. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and touched the wet pines in strips of gold. Cole rested one hand gently between Atlas's ears. The forest was being protected now. The creek had people watching it. But the story was not finished. Somewhere across the state line, an old ranger believed he had lost the last companion who had walked those woods beside him. And beside Cole stood a dog who had spent every night staring north, waiting for the world to remember. Walter Hayes lived outside Astoria, Oregon, in a small white house overlooking a stretch of gray Pacific water. 2 mornings after Margaret brought the news, Cole drove south with Atlas resting across the back seat beneath the same wool blanket that had carried him away from the cage. The journey took hours, through wet hills, quiet towns, and forests. Atlas watched through the window with steady amber eyes. He was stronger now. His coat had begun to regain its color, and the worn collar around his neck carried his name again. Cole had spoken with Walter once before leaving Washington. The old ranger had managed only a few words before his voice failed him. Bring him home, he had whispered. Cole had understood. When they reached the house, Walter was already waiting on the porch. He was 71, thin from months of poor health, with silver hair beneath a faded Forest Service cap and both hands resting on a wooden cane. For a moment, nobody moved. Cole opened the truck door. Atlas lifted his head. He saw Walter. The dog stepped onto the driveway and stopped. 20 feet separated them. Walter removed his cap. Atlas. The shepherd's ears rose. His tail moved once. Then he crossed the distance, slowly at first, as though memory were something fragile enough to frighten away. Walter lowered himself carefully onto one knee. Atlas reached him and pressed his head against the old man's chest. Walter closed both arms around him. No grand words came. Only the sound of the ocean beyond the trees and Walter breathing his dog's name into the fur between his ears. Cole turned toward the water, giving them the privacy grief sometimes deserved. Later, inside the house, Walter explained what had happened. He had reported the nighttime equipment and changes in the creek, but declining health forced him to leave Cedar Ridge before he could follow the matter through. During those confused final days, Atlas disappeared. Walter searched until his sister convinced him he needed medical care. He had carried the guilt ever since. "I thought I failed him," Walter said. Cole looked toward Atlas, asleep between their chairs. "He never stopped looking for you." Walter's eyes settled on Cole. "Sounds like he found someone else who needed finding." Cole said nothing. He did not have to. By evening, Walter admitted he could no longer give Atlas the long walks and outdoor life the shepherd needed. His hand rested on Atlas's head as he looked at Cole. "He chose you on that road." Cole glanced down. Atlas had placed one paw across his boot. The answer was already there. The next morning, Cole drove back toward Washington with Atlas beside him. The forest had been protected. Walter had gotten back the companion he thought was gone forever, even if only long enough to say hello again. And Cole, who had entered those mountains hoping to disappear from everyone who might need him, was returning to a cabin where one living soul would be waiting at the door whenever he came home. By early spring, the mountains around Cedar Ridge had changed. Snow remained in pale patches beneath the deepest trees, but the creek ran clear again, cold water moving over smooth stones beneath new green ferns. Cole noticed the difference every morning because Atlas made certain he did. The German shepherd had regained his strength, his black and tan coat thick beneath the morning sun, his amber eyes bright whenever Cole reached for his jacket. They walked the forest together now, sometimes for miles, following trails Cole had once passed without seeing. The cabin had changed too. Two bowls stood beside the kitchen wall. A worn leash hung near the door. Muddy paw prints appeared regularly across floors Cole used to keep almost painfully clean. On the refrigerator was a photograph Margaret had mailed from Oregon. Walter sat on his porch with Atlas beside him during their reunion, one weathered hand resting gently against the shepherd's neck. Cole had placed the picture there without thinking much about it. He never moved it. Walter called every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes he spoke with Cole. Sometimes Cole simply put the phone near Atlas and let Walter say his name. Atlas always recognized the voice. One warm morning in April, Cole drove back to the forgotten logging road where everything had begun. Atlas jumped down from the truck and waited beside him. The rusted cage still rested beneath the leaning fir, empty now, its door hanging open where Cole had left it months earlier. He carried it home. That afternoon, beneath a sky washed blue after rain, Cole removed the padlock, then the hinges, then the door itself. He placed the open frame near the old barn beside the cabin and filled the bottom with soil. By May, wildflowers grew through the rusted bars. Purple lupin, white yarrow, small yellow blossoms Cole did not know the name of. Atlas sometimes slept beside them in the afternoon sun. He never tried to enter the cage. He never needed to. One evening, Cole sat on the porch with coffee cooling between his hands while Atlas rested near his boots. Wind moved softly through the pines. Far below, the creek carried mountain water toward farms, homes, and families who would never know how close something precious had come to being lost. Cole thought about Walter, about Margaret, about a locked cage beside an empty road, about how easy it would have been to keep driving that rainy afternoon. Atlas lifted his head and rested it against Cole's knee. Cole placed a hand between his ears. Months earlier, he had believed he came to these mountains because he wanted silence. Now he understood that silence and peace were not the same thing. Peace had footsteps beside yours. It had a bowl beside the wall, a familiar name spoken across a telephone, and someone waiting when the road brought you home. The last sunlight passed through the trees and touched the flowers growing where a cage door had once been. Cole watched Atlas close his eyes. Sometimes mercy begins with something almost too small to notice. A sound beside a lonely road, a hand reaching for a lock, a decision to stop when it would be easier to keep going. And sometimes, when one forgotten life is carried home, you discover how many others were quietly waiting to be saved.